He built an empire worth billions. He controlled governments, crushed rivals, and made kings kneel. But tonight, standing in the most powerful room in Europe, Cassian Vorelli felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years: shame. Because the woman walking through those doors wasn't a ghost. She was real. She was radiant, and she had built something greater than anything he ever touched. Without him. The woman he discarded in front of hundreds of people. The woman he never deserved. She didn't even look at him, and that silence hit harder than any bullet ever could. If this story already has your heart racing, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Betrayal. The ballroom at the Belmont Grand in Vienna was the kind of room that didn't forgive weakness. Every surface had been designed to intimidate. Marble floors cold enough to chill through leather soles, chandeliers dripping with crystal that caught and fractured light into something almost violent, walls draped in deep charcoal silk that swallowed sound the way powerful men swallowed inconvenient truths. The guest list read like a who's who of European organized power. Arms brokers who called themselves consultants, financial architects who called themselves advisors, and politicians who called themselves public servants, while their offshore accounts told a different story entirely. This was the Cobalt Summit. Officially, it was a closed-door investment forum attended by the continent's most influential private sector leaders. Unofficially, it was the place where the real decisions got made, the kind of decisions that moved borders, collapsed markets, and determined which families would thrive for the next generation and which would quietly disappear. Cassian Vorelli owned the night. He stood near the eastern wall with a glass of still water. He hadn't touched alcohol in 4 years, a detail that unnerved people more than his reputation ever had. Wearing a black suit that had cost more than most men's cars, with nothing on his wrist except a slim watch, and nothing in his expression except the calm that came from being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He was 42. His hair had gone silver at the temples sometime around his 38th birthday, and he'd stopped fighting it. Silver looked like power. He'd learned to use what age gave him. The men around him laughed too loudly, drank too much, and kept glancing at him the way small animals glanced at large ones, constantly, involuntarily, trying to measure the threat. Cassian had learned long ago that you never needed to raise your voice when your presence already filled the room. His associate, Dario, materialized at his shoulder the way Dario always did, silent, efficient, carrying information like a man carrying a loaded weapon. Dario was 51, gray-bearded, and had been with the Vorelli organization since before Cassian took over. He was not a friend. Cassian had no friends. But Dario was the closest thing to a compass the Empire had. Margot Weissen just arrived, Dario said quietly. She's asking if you'll meet with her before the opening address. Tell her I'll send her a time tomorrow. She won't like that. She doesn't have to. Dario absorbed this without comment. That was another thing Cassian had learned. The people worth keeping around you were the ones who understood that silence was sometimes the most complete response. The room was filling faster now. The host, a skeletal Belgian named Cornelius Hacht, who ran the summit as his personal theater, was moving through the crowd with the nervous energy of a man who understood that his importance existed only as a function of the people he gathered. Without men like Cassian, Cornelius was nothing. With them, he was the center of a very specific universe. Cassian's phone buzzed once. He glanced down. A message from his head of security. She's confirmed. Arriving in 12 minutes. He put the phone away. He already knew who she was. He'd known the moment Cornelius had sent the invitation with her name attached. Listed, not as a supporting guest, not as a companion to someone more powerful, but as the evening's keynote honoree. Alara Whitmore, founder of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation. Forbes' third most influential philanthropist in Europe, named by 3 separate governments as a partner in urban redevelopment initiatives that had rehoused over 40,000 families across 11 countries. He'd read her file the way you read a wound, carefully, without flinching, knowing it would hurt. She was 38 now. He had last seen her at 31. 7 years was not a long time in the architecture of a man's life, but it was a very long time in the architecture of a marriage. Especially one that ended the way theirs had. He set his water glass on a passing tray. He did not need to think about that tonight. He needed to be present. He needed to be Cassian Varelli, feared and controlled and immovable, not the man who still sometimes sat in the dark of his study and stared at a ring he couldn't throw away. The doors opened. The temperature in the room shifted, not physically, but socially, in that invisible way that happened when someone genuinely significant entered a space. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. Even men who prided themselves on unflappability straightened almost imperceptibly. Cornelius moved to the front of the room and raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the rehearsed weight of a man who practiced this moment. "It is my particular honor to introduce this evening's most distinguished guest, the architect of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation, whose work in sustainable urban development and entrepreneurial empowerment has redefined what private capital can accomplish in the public interest. Please welcome Alara Whitmore." She walked in. Cassian had told himself he was prepared. He was not prepared. She wore midnight blue, a structured, minimal gown that didn't try to impress and therefore impressed completely. Her hair was pulled back with the kind of simplicity that cost either nothing or everything. She carried no clutch, no jewelry except a single bracelet at her right wrist, and she moved through the applause the way water moved through stone, without effort, without performance, without any apparent awareness that every eye in the room was tracking her. She shook Cornelius's hand. She smiled, not the wide, deferential smile of a woman trying to be liked, but the contained, precise smile of a woman who had learned exactly how much warmth to show and when. Then her eyes swept the room the way a strategist surveyed a battlefield, and for one fraction of 1 second, those eyes landed on Cassian. She didn't stop. She didn't blink. She didn't alter her expression by a single degree. She looked at him the way she might look at a piece of furniture she remembered from a house she used to live in, with a recognition so neutral it was worse than hatred. Then she looked away. Cassian realized he had stopped breathing. He forced himself to exhale. He forced himself to look at the wall, the floor, anywhere except her. His jaw was tight. His chest was doing something uncooperative. Dario was watching him. "Should I?" Dario started. "No," Cassian said. "Nothing." He picked up another water glass from a passing server and held it without drinking from it. He needed something to do with his hands, because the woman who had just walked into that room had been his wife. And the empire that everyone in this room feared and respected, the one that had taken a failing family organization and turned it into a continental force, had been built in every way that mattered by her. He hadn't known that when it mattered. He knew it now. He'd known it for 6 years, and it still felt like a blade that hadn't been removed. He had met Alara Whitmore at a financial conference in Milan 11 years ago, when he was 31 and she was 27, and he was already 2 years into the slow, brutal process of trying to save the Varelli organization from his father's catastrophic decisions. Matteo Varelli had ruled the family with the conviction of a man who had never been seriously wrong, which meant he had never developed the capacity to recognize when he was. He'd overextended the organization into Eastern European territory that wasn't theirs, made enemies of 3 families who'd previously been neutral, and funneled capital into ventures so aggressively illegal that even the organization's most loyal lawyers had started quietly updating their own contingency plans. Cassian had inherited a ticking problem. He didn't have the relationships to fix it diplomatically. He didn't have the capital to buy his way out. What he had was a last name that people still respected out of habit, and a brain that worked differently than his father's. He saw systems, patterns, the way money moved and where it could be redirected. What he didn't have was the financial infrastructure to make that vision operational. Alara had been attending the Milan conference as a junior analyst representing a Swiss investment advisory firm. She was not supposed to be in the room where the private session happened. He wasn't entirely sure afterward how she'd gotten in, but she'd sat in the 3rd row during a panel on emerging market restructuring, and she'd asked a question that made every senior figure in the room go very quiet because it was the question none of them had wanted to answer out loud. After the session, he'd found her in the corridor outside, drinking terrible conference coffee and reading through a document on her phone like she hadn't just embarrassed 6 men with combined assets over $1 trillion. "That was a good question," he said. She looked up. She didn't smile the way people smiled at him, carefully, with too much effort. She just looked at him evenly. "It was an obvious question," she said. "Nobody wanted to say it because they'd all built their strategies on the assumption that it wasn't true." "Which assumption?" that capital follows stability. She went back to her phone. It doesn't. Capital follows narrative, big difference. He stood there a moment longer than he intended to. Cassian Varelli, he said. I know who you are, she said, and her tone made it clear that this was neither impressive nor threatening, just information. He'd been trying to find a reason to keep the conversation going ever since. They were together for 8 months before he told her what the Varelli name actually meant. Not the public version, the shipping companies, the hospitality investments, the charitable foundations that operated as respectable surfaces, but the real architecture beneath, the part that operated in the dark. He'd expected her to leave. She didn't. She sat across from him in his apartment in Florence and looked at him for a long time with that particular stillness she had, the kind that meant she was calculating rather than reacting. And then she said, the legitimate side is salvageable, but only if it's actually legitimate, not as a front, as a real thing. That's not how my father I didn't ask about your father. He had not had a conversation like that in his adult life, with anyone. What I'm saying, she continued, setting her coffee down, is that if you want to build something that lasts, you have to decide which thing you're actually building, the shadow empire or the real one. You can't sustain both indefinitely. One will always eventually consume the other. You're talking about dismantling 30 years of I'm talking about redirecting 30 years of capital and infrastructure into something that doesn't require you to sleep with one eye open for the rest of your life. She looked at him with complete steadiness. But you have to actually want that. Not just say it. He wanted it, or he had wanted it, in that room with her looking at him like that. They married 2 years later, quietly, in a civil ceremony in Rome with a guest list so small it barely constituted a gathering. Matteo Varelli refused to attend on the grounds that Elara was nobody. No bloodline, no political connections, no property. An outsider who'd turned his son's head and was steering the organization in a direction that made the old man deeply uneasy. What Matteo didn't know, what Cassian wouldn't discover for years, was that Elara had liquidated the inheritance her grandmother had left her. A considerable sum, carefully invested over 7 years. She funneled it through intermediary structures she'd built herself, creating the seed capital for the Varelli Group's first genuinely legitimate acquisitions. She used her connections from the Swiss firm, contacts she'd spent years cultivating, to position Cassian in front of the right investors at the right moments. She drafted the financial narratives that made previously skeptical partners willing to take a risk on the Varelli name. She did all of this without telling him, not out of deception, out of her particular kind of pride. She didn't want him to feel indebted. She wanted him to become the thing she believed he could be, and she understood, better than he did, that men like Cassian Varelli didn't accept help gracefully. So she gave it in ways he couldn't see. The empire grew. And as it grew, something else happened. Something slow and quiet and ugly, the way the worst changes always are. Cassian started listening to his father again. Not immediately, not obviously. But Matteo was persistent in the way that old men with wounded pride are persistent, constantly present, constantly whispering about legacy and strength and the weakness of men who let women lead them. And Cassian, who had grown up inside that particular pressure, had never been entirely free of it. Elara noticed the shift before he did. She brought it up twice, directly, which was the only way she operated. The first time, he dismissed it. The second time, they had the worst argument of their marriage. Not loud, not dramatic, but cold and precise in the way that only two intelligent people who know exactly where to cut could manage. He told her she was imagining things. She told him she never imagined things. They didn't speak for 2 days. Then it passed. The way things pass when you want them to, when it's easier to believe the problem has resolved than to look directly at the evidence that it hasn't. The anniversary gala was Cassian's idea. 3 years into their marriage. A celebration. Their partnership. The organization's transformation. A very public statement that the Varelli name now meant something different than it used to. He'd rented out an entire estate outside Milan. 300 guests. A statement event. He told Elara it was for them. He told himself that too. The truth was messier. He wanted the world to see what he'd built. He wanted his father's peers to see what he'd built. He wanted the people who'd written him off as Matteo's unworthy heir to look at the room and understand that they had been wrong about him. He was still, underneath the empire, a man trying to prove something. Alara had worn white, not a wedding gown. She wasn't performing that, just a white dress, structured and severe, and she'd looked like exactly what she was, the most capable person at the event, dressed simply because she didn't need to try. The first hour went exactly as planned. Then Dario appeared at his shoulder, 3 years younger and slightly less gray, with an expression Cassian had never seen on him before. "There's someone here," Dario said. "She says she knows you. She's asking to speak with you before the ceremony." "Who?" Dario handed him a card. "Valentina Rossetti." The name hit him in the chest like a flat stone. He'd been 22 when he met Valentina. She was the first woman he'd loved, or believed he'd loved, before he understood what love actually cost. They'd been together for 3 years. Then her family had relocated and she'd chosen the relocation over him, and he'd spent the better part of 2 years reconstructing himself around the absence. He looked at the card. He should have handed it back to Dario and said, "Send her away. Tonight is not the night." What he said was, "Where is she?" But the room they brought him to was a small salon off the main corridor, gold wallpaper and old furniture and too much light. Valentina stood near the window. She was 33 and looked exactly the way he'd kept her in memory. Dark hair, particular posture, the kind of beauty that arrived with an awareness of itself. "Cassian," she said. "Valentina." He kept his voice level. "This isn't a good time." "I know." She didn't move from the window. "I know what tonight is. I know I shouldn't be here." "Then why are you?" She exhaled. Her hands were clasped in front of her in a way that looked almost rehearsed, though he didn't clock that until much later when the full picture had assembled itself. "Because I made a mistake," she said, "the biggest one of my life, and I've spent the last 6 years trying to figure out how to say that to your face." He should have ended the conversation there. He stood in the doorway for 40 seconds. He counted them, afterward, in the long and specific hell of his regret. And in those 40 seconds, something old and unresolved moved through him like water through cracked stone. His father appeared in the corridor behind him, Matteo Vorelli, who was not supposed to be in that wing of the estate, who had clearly known exactly where this room was. "Let the girl speak," Matteo said quietly. Cassian looked at his father, then at Valentina. Then, in his mind's eye, at Alara standing in a white dress in a ballroom 1 corridor away, waiting for a husband who was standing in the wrong room. And he stayed. He stayed for 17 minutes. When he walked back into the main ballroom, Valentina at his side, every molecule of what he was about to do had already been decided. Not in his mind, but in the part of him that his father had spent 40 years shaping. The part that believed power meant never appearing uncertain. The part that believed returning to what you'd lost was somehow the same as recovering it. Alara saw him before he saw her. She was standing near the center of the room, champagne in hand, talking to a group of partners' wives, and she saw him come through the door with Valentina beside him, and her expression didn't shatter. It simply went still. The complete dangerous stillness of a woman who had already begun calculating. He crossed the room toward her. He told himself he would explain. He told himself she would understand. He told himself that he just needed a moment to... Alara set her champagne glass on a table. She turned to face him fully, and without one person in that room missing a moment of it, she reached up and unclasped her engagement ring, the ring she wore beside her wedding band, and then unclasped the wedding band itself, and she placed both of them into his open hand. Her eyes met his. "You didn't choose her," she said, her voice low and completely steady. "You chose the version of yourself that never grew up." Then she walked past him. She walked past Valentina without a glance. She walked through 300 people and out the main doors, and she did not look back once. Cassian stood in the center of the room with 2 rings in his hand and the sound of 300 people who had seen everything, heard everything, and were now very carefully looking in all the wrong directions. He told himself it would be fine. He told himself she would call by morning. He drove home at 2 in the morning to their house in the hills east of Milan and stood in the hallway and listened to the complete absence of her. Her coat was gone from the hook by the door. The kitchen was clean, not the clean of someone who had tidied up, but the clean of someone who had removed everything that belonged to them. Her desk in the study was bare. The photographs she'd kept on the windowsill in the bedroom were gone, though the slight dust shadows where the frames had sat were still there. He went to the kitchen table. The two rings sat exactly at the center of it, not thrown, placed, with precision, the way Alara did everything. He sat down in a chair and didn't move for a very long time, and somewhere in that stillness, the first crack appeared in the certainty that this could be undone. He didn't know yet that she had funded his empire. He didn't know yet that the woman who had just walked out was the actual architect of everything he claimed as his. He didn't know yet that by morning, the woman who'd quietly built him into one of the most powerful men in Europe would be completely, systematically, irrevocably gone. What he knew, sitting alone in a clean kitchen with two rings on a table, was that something had broken in a way that he didn't yet have the language to measure. He reached out and picked up one of the rings. He held it. Outside, the hills were dark. The morning after the gala, Cassian did not sleep. He sat in the kitchen until the hills outside the windows went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a Lombardy dawn that had no interest in his suffering, and he did not move from the chair except once, around 4 in the morning, to make coffee he didn't drink. The two rings stayed on the table in front of him. He'd put the one he'd been holding back down sometime around 3. He couldn't remember exactly when. Time had become soft and unreliable, which was a sensation he had no framework for. Cassian Vorelli had spent his entire adult life inside the hard architecture of schedules, decisions, consequences. He did not do soft. He did not do unreliable. He did not do this. His phone had 43 messages. He knew this because he'd looked at the screen once, seen the number, and put it face down on the table. He didn't need to read them. He could construct their content without effort. Dario checking in, 3 partners who'd been at the gala and wanted to know what the situation was, his father, definitely his father, probably multiple times, and at least a dozen peripheral contacts who'd witnessed the scene and were performing concern while actually conducting reconnaissance. Nobody from Alara. He'd known there wouldn't be. She didn't operate that way. When Alara Whitmore made a decision, she made it completely, and she didn't revisit it while the wound was still open. That was one of the things that had first made him trust her and was now, in the gray kitchen light, the thing destroying him most efficiently. At 7:15, he heard a car on the gravel outside. He didn't move. The door opened. Matteo Vorelli let himself in with the key he'd had since the house was purchased, a detail Cassian had always meant to address, and never had, in the way that small oversights accumulate into structural failures. His father was 68, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark coat despite the early warmth outside, and he moved through the kitchen doorway with the particular confidence of a man who had decided in advance that this conversation would go the way he wanted it to. He looked at the table, at the rings, at Cassian. "You look terrible," Matteo said. "Get out." Matteo pulled out the chair opposite and sat down. "I made some calls this morning. The partners are concerned but manageable. Ferretti is the only one talking, and Ferretti always talks. I'll handle him." Cassian looked at his father. "I said get out of my house." "It'll settle down. These things always settle. In 2 weeks, nobody remembers the scene. They remember the outcome." Matteo folded his hands on the table. "And the outcome here is that you made the right choice." Something cold moved through Cassian's chest. "You knew she was coming," he said. "Last night. You knew before I did." Matteo's expression didn't change by much. Just a slight compression around the eyes, the micro-adjustment of a man who'd spent decades managing inconvenient truths. "Valentina reached out to me. She wanted to reconnect. I thought." "You thought?" Cassian's voice was very quiet. The quieter he got, the more dangerous it became, and Matteo had known this about his son long enough to register it. "You arranged it. I facilitated a conversation. On my anniversary. Because it needed to happen before you buried yourself completely in a marriage that was taking you somewhere I couldn't follow." Matteo leaned forward slightly. "Alara is smart. I've always said she's smart. But smart women with their own agendas are not the same as loyal women, Cassian. The direction she was pushing this organization, she was pushing it towards something legitimate. She was pushing it towards something hers." The word landed hard. Every decision she influenced, every investment she shepherded, every partner she brought to the table, it all ran through her. Her contacts, her frameworks, her vision. Do you understand what that means? It means the moment she decides to walk, She takes half the architecture with her. Cassian stared at his father. He did not say, then maybe that's what the organization deserved. He thought it. He thought it with a clarity that surprised him. But he didn't say it, because some part of him was still too deep inside the system his father had built around him, and that was the most honest accounting of his own failure he would manage for quite some time. Leave, he said instead. Matteo stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at the rings on the table with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, too controlled for that, but was something adjacent to it. She'll be fine, Matteo said. Women like her always land on their feet. That's the thing about capable people. They survive everything. He moved toward the door. It's the rest of us who need protecting. He left. Cassian sat alone in the kitchen for another hour and a half. Then he picked up his phone and called Ilara's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Not the automated voicemail, but her recorded voice, brisk and professional. You've reached Ilara Whitmore. Leave a message and I'll return your call. He sat with the sound of her voice in his ear for the 3 seconds before the beep, and then he said, "Call me back, please," and hung up. She did not call back. He called twice more over the following 24 hours. Same result. On the 3rd day, he drove to the apartment she'd kept in the city, a small place near the Brera district that she'd maintained throughout their marriage as what she called an office away from the house, though he understood now that it had also been something else. A place that was entirely hers, untouched by the Varelli gravity. The buzzer produced silence. The building manager, when Cassian found him, said that Miss Boss Whitmore had collected her remaining things 2 days prior and had not left a forwarding address. Cassian stood on the street outside for a moment. A woman walked past with a small dog. A delivery cyclist cut across the corner. The city operated with complete indifference to the specific implosion happening on that square meter of pavement. He went back to his car and sat in it for a while without starting the engine. Valentina moved into the Milan house 6 weeks later. This was not entirely Cassian's decision, which was itself a revealing fact that he wasn't yet equipped to examine. She had been a constant presence since the gala, available and warm and radiating the particular energy of a woman who had wanted something for a long time and was now carefully consolidating her position. She mentioned the house in a way that made moving in feel like his idea. She was skilled at that. The house felt different with her in it. Not worse, precisely. Not better. Just fundamentally different in the way that a room looks different when you've replaced the furniture. The dimensions are the same, the light falls the same way, but your body keeps reaching for things that aren't where they used to be. Valentina didn't use Ilara's study. She converted the room into something else without asking, which was not a small thing, and Cassian didn't say anything about it, which was also not a small thing. He told himself it was practical. He told himself that space couldn't sit empty. The truth was that watching the study become something different made it easier not to think about what it had been. Dario came to him 3 weeks after Valentina's arrival with the expression he wore when he had information he didn't want to deliver. "There's something you should see," Dario said. They were in Cassian's office at the Varelli Group headquarters, 18th floor, glass walls overlooking a city that looked from this altitude like an intricate machine. Dario set a folder on the desk. Cassian opened it. Inside were financial documents, transfer records, traced through 3 different intermediary structures across 2 jurisdictions, but traced. Dario had found someone capable enough to follow the thread all the way back. Cassian looked at the originating account information. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did these come from?" he said. "The seed capital for the Ferretti acquisition," Dario said. "The one 4 years ago that opened the northern expansion. I started pulling the original transaction architecture because the Ferretti situation last week made me want to understand the full exposure. And when I followed the source accounts back far enough," he paused. "The money came from Ilara." Cassian set the folder down. "That's not possible," he said. His voice came out slightly wrong, too flat, the way voices went when the body was absorbing something too large for immediate processing. "It's possible," Dario said, "because it's documented. She created the structures herself. They're elegant, actually, almost impossible to detect without knowing what you're looking for. But the originating capital was hers. Personal funds. Substantial. And this wasn't the only transaction. He reached over and turned to the third page. There are at least 4 separate injections I've identified so far. The Ferretti acquisition, the Marchetti partnership, the Geneva licensing deal, and the original line of credit that got the hospitality portfolio off the ground. He let that sit for a moment. Cassian, the first legitimate pillar of this organization, was built with her money. Cassian stood up. He walked to the window and looked at the city below, which continued to operate as a machine, indifferent, precise. And he pressed one hand flat against the glass and felt the cold of it against his palm, and stood there for a long time without speaking. "How much total?" he said finally. "Conservatively, given the multiplier effect of what those investments returned?" Dario was quiet for a moment. Without her, the Ferretti deal doesn't happen. Without Ferretti, the northern expansion stalls for at least 2 years. Without the northern expansion, the Geneva licensing deal doesn't have the profile to close. "Bis tol," he exhaled. "I'm not able to put a clean number on it, Skyasin, but I can tell you that the organization you're running right now looks substantially different. Maybe doesn't exist in this form at all. Without what she put in." Cassian took his hand off the glass. "Did my father know?" Dario didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Dario." "I don't know how much he knew," Dario said carefully, "but I think the reason he wanted her out wasn't just about control of the organization's direction." He paused again. "I think he knew enough to understand that she had leverage he didn't like. Not leverage she was using, she never used it, but leverage that existed." Cassian turned around. His face was doing something that Dario, in 30 years of watching difficult men navigate impossible information, had not seen on Cassian Varelli's face before. It was cracking, very slightly, around the edges. Not breaking, not collapsing, just developing the first visible fractures. "Find her," Cassian said. "I've already started," Dario said. "But she's not making it easy." Tic-tac-tic. She wasn't making it easy because she had no intention of being found. Not by him, not yet. Not while the wound was this fresh and she still needed both hands free to build what came next. Elara had left Milan with one carry-on bag and a laptop and the absolute clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years watching a slow disaster approach and had, somewhere in the final months, accepted its inevitability and begun preparing accordingly. She had not been impulsive the night of the gala. The ring removal, the 7 words, the walk through 300 witnesses. None of that was impulse. It was the execution of a decision she'd been carrying for a long time, waiting for the moment when it would hurt most precisely and be most impossible to misinterpret. She had landed in Zurich, stayed 2 days with a former colleague who asked no questions, and then moved on. She was methodical about covering her immediate movements, not paranoid, but sensible. She knew the Varelli organization well enough to know how it operated when it wanted to locate someone. She ended up in Edinburgh, a rental flat near Leith, small and damp and nothing like the Milan house, which was exactly what she needed. She needed the distance to feel physical, not just emotional. She needed to be somewhere cold and unfamiliar where the light was different and the sounds outside the window were different, and nothing accidentally felt like him. She spent the first week doing very little. She slept a great deal. She ate sporadically. She sat at the small kitchen table with her laptop and stared at financial models she'd started building 6 months ago. Contingency architecture, she'd called it privately, the framework for what came after. And some days she worked for hours, and some days she just stared at the numbers until they stopped meaning anything. She did not cry exactly. Or she cried once on the 4th night, briefly, and with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that grief had a practical dimension and that not releasing it had costs. Then she stopped and washed her face and went back to the models. What she'd built for Cassian had always carried a dual purpose, though she'd never articulated this to herself fully until now. She'd done it because she believed in what he could become. That was true. But she'd also done it the way she did everything, with the quiet understanding that the work itself had value independent of the outcome, that making something real was its own justification. The money was gone, and she was at peace with that. It wasn't what she'd lost that mattered. What she'd lost was the belief that he would choose correctly when it counted. She'd been wrong about that. She was not wrong often, and being wrong about that particular thing, about that particular man, sat in her chest with a specific weight that she examined methodically over those Edinburgh weeks, the way you examine a structural failure in something you designed yourself. Not with shame, exactly, but with the hard, humbling determination to understand exactly where the calculation had gone wrong. She called her former colleague Priya in late November. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "I know," Priya said immediately. "How bad is it?" "The marriage? It's done. That's not the something." A pause. "Then what's the something?" "I have a framework for a foundation. I've been building it for about 8 months, quietly. Impact investment model, affordable housing and entrepreneurial development, European and eventually global scope. I have relationships I've been cultivating. Some of them I built for him, and some of them I built for myself, and I know the difference." "You're serious." "I'm always serious." "Alara." Priya's voice shifted into something careful. "You just walked out of a marriage to one of the most connected and frankly dangerous men in Europe. You're talking about launching a public-facing foundation." "Yes." "He'll find you." "Probably." She looked out the window at the Edinburgh rain hitting gray stone. "But I'm not hiding from him. I'm just not available to him. Those are different things. He's going to want to fix it." "He doesn't get to fix it," Alara said. Her voice was completely steady. "He made his decision in front of 300 people. That decision is the one that stands." Cassian found her in February. Not personally. Dario found her, or rather, found the corporate registration filing for what would become the Whitmore Legacy Foundation, submitted through an Edinburgh-based solicitor, with Alara Whitmore listed as sole founding director. He stared at the filing. Then he got on a plane. He found the building from the address on the registration. He found the flat number from the solicitor's office, which he visited in person because in-person visits from men who looked like Cassian Varelli tended to produce information faster than phone calls. He stood outside her door at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in February, in Edinburgh rain that was cold enough to make his jaw tight, and he knocked. She opened the door. She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that calculated everything and gave nothing away for free. "You found the filing," she said. "Yes. I didn't hide it. I know." She stood in the doorway without moving aside to let him in. She was wearing dark trousers and a gray sweater and no makeup, and she looked rested in the specific way that people looked rested when they'd been sleeping properly for the first time in a long time. "What do you want, Cassian?" she said. "To talk. We're talking. Inside." She considered this for a moment, then stepped aside. The flat was small and spare and neat, in the way that her spaces were always neat. Not obsessively, just intentionally, everything with a reason for being where it was. There were papers on the kitchen table, the financial models she'd been working on. A half-drunk cup of tea. Books stacked on the windowsill. She didn't offer him anything. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at him and waited. He sat down across from her. "I know about the investments," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, just a slight recalibration. The look of someone who'd known a conversation was coming and was now calculating its exact shape. "Which ones?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Ferretti? Marchetti? Geneva. The hospitality credit line." He watched her face. Dario traced them back. "Dario's good," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you would have been too proud to use the money if you'd known it was mine, and you needed it." "That wasn't your decision to make." "No," she said. "It was mine. I made it." She picked up her tea, looked at it, set it back down. "You came here to tell me you know about the money." "I came here to—" He stopped. The words that had seemed adequate on the plane had become inadequate in this room. "I want to fix this." "There's nothing to fix." "Alara." "Cassian." Her voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been. "I'm not angry at you anymore. I processed that. What I am is finished." She met his eyes directly. "What we had was real. I want you to know I believe that. You weren't pretending, and neither was I. But the man who stood in that room in Milan and made that choice, he's the man you actually are. And the woman who would take you back after that is someone I don't intend to be." "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," she said. "Mistakes are accidents. You had 17 minutes in a room with your father and your past, and you came out of it with a decision. That's not a mistake. The word 17 hit him somewhere specific. She knew the number. She'd calculated it, or someone had told her, or she'd simply assessed the timeline from the evidence. Of course she had. Valentina is not, he started. I don't care about Valentina, Elara said. I genuinely don't. She's not the point, and I think you know that. She looked at him evenly. The point is what you chose when it cost you something to choose it. That's always the point. He sat with that. Outside, the rain intensified against the window glass. The building's heating made a sound in the walls. The model documents on the table between them fluttered slightly from a draft somewhere. I spoke to Priya, he said quietly, about what you're building. When? Last week. I wanted to understand the scope. Something tightened in her expression for the first time. Not anger, but a wariness. The look of someone who had just registered that the boundaries they'd set were not holding the way they'd assumed. Cassian, I can provide capital, he said. Silent. No involvement, no credit, no strings. The organization can... Stop! Her voice came out flat and final. Stop right there. He stopped. You don't get to fund this, she said. Do you understand me? This is mine. Completely mine. Not mine with your money underneath it. Not mine with your infrastructure quietly supporting it. She leaned forward slightly. I spent 3 years building your empire without you knowing it. I'm not spending the next decade building mine the same way in reverse. This is not a transaction, Cassian. It's not something you can buy your way into or out of. I'm not trying to buy... You're trying to stay connected, she said. And I understand that, but the answer is no. He looked at her for a long moment. The flat was very quiet except for the rain. What if I came back to Milan, he said. Not for Valentina, not for my father, just... No. You haven't let me finish. I don't need to. She stood up. It was a signal, and they both knew it. You should go. He didn't move immediately. He sat at her table and looked at the financial models spread between them, the architecture of the future she was building without him. And he understood, in a way that was physical as much as cognitive, that he was looking at the most expensive thing he had ever lost. He stood up. I'm going to want to know you're safe, he said. I'm always safe, she said. I look after myself. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle. Elara. He said her name quietly, the way he used to say it in rooms where it was just the two of them. I'm sorry. She looked at him from across the flat. Her face was completely composed, but something in her eyes, something very small and very buried and very real, moved. I know, she said. He left. He took the stairs down and walked out into the Edinburgh rain and stood on the wet stone pavement and felt the cold work through his coat. His driver was parked at the corner. He did not walk toward the car immediately. He stood in the rain for a moment and let it fall on him because he deserved at least that much discomfort. And then he walked to the car and got in. Airport? His driver asked. Yes, he said. The car pulled away. He watched the building disappear in the rear window. On the plane back to Milan, he stared at the tray table in front of him for 2 hours and said nothing to anyone. Somewhere over the Alps, it hit him with the full weight of something he'd been avoiding since Dario first laid the documents on his desk. She had built the empire. She had done it quietly, without credit, without leverage, because she believed in him. And he had stood in a room with his father for 17 minutes and dismantled everything she'd given him. And now Valentina was in his house, in the city she didn't belong in, and Elara was in a flat in Edinburgh building something extraordinary. And the Varelli organization was running on a foundation that a woman he'd abandoned had secretly laid. He landed in Milan at midnight. He went home. Valentina was awake, sitting in the main salon with a glass of wine and her phone. She looked up when he came in. She smiled, the particular smile she had that was warm on the surface and calculating underneath. A distinction he was, for the first time, seeing clearly. How did it go? She said. Fine, he said. Did you see her? He looked at Valentina for a long moment. Really looked at her. At the careful performance of ease, at the possessive comfort with which she occupied a space that had belonged to someone else, at the wine glass angled just so in a hand that understood its own appearance. Yes, he said. And? And nothing, he said. He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed very slowly, in and out, the way Alara had once taught him to breathe when the pressure of the organization felt like a physical weight. She'd read it in a book about executive performance. She'd been completely unsentimental about it. It's mechanics, not mysticism. Just breathe correctly and your body stops catastrophizing. He breathed correctly. His body catastrophized anyway. Because downstairs was a woman who had appeared at exactly the moment his father needed her to. And upstairs was the memory of a flat in Edinburgh with financial models on the table and rain on the windows. And somewhere in the calculus of those two facts was a truth he was only just beginning to be able to look at directly. He had not just lost Alara. He had been maneuvered into losing her. By his father. Using Valentina as the instrument. And he had walked into it with his eyes open because the version of himself his father had spent 40 years building was still, underneath everything he'd tried to become, the one who showed up when the pressure was highest. He took his phone out. He opened Dario's contact. He typed, "I need everything you have on Valentina Rossetti, who she's been talking to, who's been paying her, everything, tonight." He sent it. He put the phone face down on the nightstand. In the dark, in the Milan house that smelled wrong and felt wrong and was wrong in every way that mattered, Cassian Vorelli finally stopped lying to himself about what he had actually done, and who had helped him do it. And in Edinburgh, Alara Whitmore sat at her kitchen table after he left, looked at the financial models spread across it, pressed her fingers flat against the paper, and made herself breathe until the thing in her chest that had moved when he said her name was still and quiet. And Dario delivered the file on Valentina Rossetti at 7 the following morning. He came in person, which meant it was worse than a phone call could contain. Cassian was already awake, had been awake since 4, sitting in his study with the door closed and the lights low, going through the organization's financial architecture the way a surgeon went through tissue after a diagnosis, methodically, looking for everything that shouldn't be there. He heard Dario's car on the gravel. He heard the front door open, because Valentina had given Dario the code without being asked to, which was itself a data point Cassian filed and held. Dario came into the study and set a folder on the desk. He didn't sit down. That was the tell. In 30 years, Dario had always sat down. Cassian opened the folder. The first page was a phone record, Valentina's secondary mobile. Not the number she used with Cassian, a different one, prepaid, purchased 11 months ago in a name that didn't belong to her. The call log ran to 3 pages. One number appeared with a frequency that organized itself, as Cassian read down the list, into a pattern so clear it was almost elegant. He knew the number before he checked the identifier at the bottom of the page. Matteo Vorelli's private line. Cassian turned to the second page. Financial transfers. Small enough individually to avoid the thresholds that triggered automatic review. Consistent enough in timing to constitute a salary. The originating account traced back through 2 shells to a holding structure that Cassian recognized. It was one his father had set up in the early years of the organization's expansion, one that had never been formally dissolved, one that existed in the architecture of the empire, the way old load-bearing walls existed in renovated buildings, invisible until you needed to understand why something was where it was. Valentina had been on his father's payroll for 11 months before she walked into the salon at the Milan Gala. Cassian set the page down. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. The room was very still. "How far back does the relationship go?" he said. His voice came out level. He was working to keep it level. "The financial connection starts 11 months before the gala," Dario said. "But the phone contact goes back further. About 2 years. 2 years. Cassian looked at the wall. "She made contact with my father 2 years before the gala. Or he made contact with her. I can't determine the direction from what I have." "Does it matter?" Dario didn't answer because it didn't. Cassian stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the Milan morning was doing its usual thing. Clean light, early traffic, the city assembling itself for another day with total indifference to the specific catastrophe happening in this room. He pressed his knuckles against the glass and looked at the street below. "The story she told me," he said slowly, "in the salon, that she'd made a mistake, that she'd never stopped." He stopped himself. "That was scripted." "Almost certainly." My father wrote it. Or approved it, Dario said. She may have had input. She's not unintelligent. Cassian turned around. For the first time in the conversation, Dario took a step back. Not far, just slightly. The involuntary adjustment of a man who understood that what was behind Cassian's eyes at that moment was not something to stand directly in front of. Where is he? Cassian said. His house in Como. He's been there since last week. Call him. Tell him I'm coming. Cassian. Tell him I'm coming, Dario. Don't warn him. Just tell him. Dario took out his phone. Cassian walked out of the study and down the hall and stopped at the door to the main salon, where Valentina was asleep on the couch with a throw blanket pulled up, and her phone on the cushion beside her, and her hair spread in a way that, weeks ago, had looked natural to him, and now looked arranged. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. She was breathing slowly, evenly, the deep sleep of someone with an untroubled conscience, which told him something important about the architecture of her interior world. He did not wake her. He got in the car. Mom. The drive to Como took an hour and 40 minutes. Cassian drove it in just over an hour because his driver understood, without being told, that this was not a morning for traffic laws. Matteo's house sat above the lake on a terrace of old stone, surrounded by cypress trees and silence, and the particular atmosphere of a place that had housed several generations of difficult men making consequential decisions. Cassian had grown up visiting this house. He knew every room, every corridor, the way the light moved through the east-facing windows in the morning, and the sound the wooden stairs made in the cold. He let himself through the gate with his own key. A housekeeper appeared in the entry, and he moved past her without slowing. He found his father in the breakfast room, seated at the head of the long table, reading something on a tablet, a coffee at his right hand and the lake visible through the tall windows behind him, still and silver in the morning light. Matteo looked up when Cassian came through the door. His expression performed surprise and did not commit to it. You should have called, Matteo said. Cassian pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. He set the folder on the table between them. He did not push it toward his father. He just set it there. Matteo looked at it. He looked at Cassian. You've been busy, Matteo said. 11 months, Cassian said. You had her on payroll 11 months before the gala. You ran it through the Ravenna holding structure. The one you told me was dormant. He paused. 2 years of phone contact before that, which means you found her, or she found you, roughly 8 months into my marriage. Matteo set his tablet down. You were disappearing, Matteo said. His voice was composed, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head and was now delivering the version he'd prepared. Into her world, her frameworks, her vision for what this organization should be. I watched it happen for 2 years, and I watched you become someone I didn't recognize. Someone legitimate, Cassian said. Someone controllable, Matteo said flatly. By her. Not by the organization. Not by the family. By one woman with her own agenda who had inserted herself into the financial architecture of everything we'd built and was quietly redirecting it according to her own map. He leaned forward. I did what I had to do. You hired a woman to destroy my marriage. I provided an alternative. The words landed in the room and sat there. Cassian looked at his father across the long table, across the distance of the breakfast room with its cypress-framed lake view and its old silver coffee service, and its 2 generations of men who had learned to call cruelty by the names of strategy and necessity, and he felt something he had never felt cleanly before in his father's presence. Not anger exactly, though the anger was there, something older and more foundational, something that had been building since a kitchen table with 2 rings on it and had been gathering mass ever since. She built the empire, Cassian said. His voice was very quiet. You knew that. A pause. I knew she'd invested, Matteo said. I didn't know the full scope until Dario started pulling the threads. By that point she was already gone. Cassian leaned forward. You knew she was the financial foundation of the first legitimate expansion, and you had her removed anyway. I knew she had leverage I couldn't control, Matteo said. And leverage you weren't aware of is leverage that can be used against you at any time. She was a risk. She was my wife. She was a risk, Matteo repeated, and the flatness in his voice made it clear that in his accounting these were not contradictory statements. Cassian stood up. He picked up the folder. He looked at his father one more time, at the old man sitting at the head of his table with his coffee and his lake view and his complete architectural conviction that everything he had done was justified by the outcome. And he understood with a clarity that felt like stepping out of a dark room into hard light, that he was looking at what he would become if he stayed on the path he was on. "I'm restructuring the organization," Cassian said. "Effective immediately, all decisions requiring capital above operational threshold go through the board, not through you. Your advisory role is suspended pending a full review of the Ravenna holding structure and every transaction it touched." He paused. "And Valentina leaves the Milan house today." Matteo's expression shifted for the first time. "You don't have the authority to—" "I have every authority," Cassian said. "You gave it to me 3 years ago when you signed the succession transfer. I have the lawyer's signatures and the board's ratification and the original documents in a safe that you don't have the combination to." He looked at his father steadily. "You built this organization on the principle that power consolidates upward. Congratulations. It consolidated." He walked out of the breakfast room. He walked through this house he'd spent his childhood in, past the old photographs in the corridor and the dark furniture and the accumulated weight of a family that had spent generations choosing power over everything else that mattered, and he went through the front door and down the stone steps and got back into the car. His hands, on his thighs, were not quite steady. He pressed them flat against his legs and breathed. Valentina was awake when he got back to Milan. She was in the kitchen, making coffee in the particular unhurried way she did everything domestic, slowly, with the ease of someone who had decided that this space was hers and had no reason to question that decision. She heard him come in and turned and smiled, and the smile was warm and practiced and landed on him like something he needed to step back from. "You were gone early," she said. "Sit down," he said. The smile shifted. Not much. Just a recalibration at the edges, the micro-adjustment of a woman who had been in enough rooms with enough powerful men to recognize a change in atmospheric pressure. She sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. He set his phone on the table between them, screen up, with the photo of the transfer records already open. She looked at the screen. She looked at it for a long time, without saying anything. 11 months, he said. "The account in Ravenna, my father's structure, regular transfers, consistent timing." He watched her face. "How much of what you told me in that salon was real?" She looked up from the phone. Her eyes were doing something complicated. Not guilt, precisely, because guilt required a moral framework she didn't seem to have handy, but a kind of rapid recalculation, like watching someone reassess a chess position they thought was winning and find it isn't. "Cassian." "Don't," he said. "Don't use my name like that right now. Answer the question." A long pause. "I did feel something," she said, "when I first came back. I want you to know that." "That's not an answer." "Your father reached out to me." She said it simply, without visible shame, which told him she'd already decided that the version of this conversation where she tried to perform innocence wasn't viable. "About 18 months before the gala, he said you were in a marriage that was wrong for the organization and wrong for you, and that if I still had feelings for you, now was the time. And he paid you to come back. He compensated me for my time and travel, and he paid you," Cassian said. She stopped. "Yes," she said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Morning light moved across the table between them, falling across his phone and her coffee cup, and the space where something had just ended without drama, without shouting, with the bleak anticlimactic weight of a thing that had been false from the beginning and was now simply confirmed. "Pack your things," he said. "Cassian, all of them," he said. "Today. I'll have Dario arrange—" "Where am I supposed to go?" He looked at her without expression. "That's genuinely not my problem," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and for just a second, under the calculation and the performance and the particular professional veneer of a woman who'd spent her adult life navigating powerful men's worlds, he saw something almost real. A flash of something frightened, or humiliated, or both. It passed quickly. She picked up her coffee cup and stood. "For what it's worth," she said, moving toward the door. "He was right that the marriage was wrong for the organization. He was just wrong about the reason." She walked out. He sat at the kitchen table alone. The Milan house was very quiet. "About," The full picture assembled itself over the following 3 weeks, and it was worse than he'd calculated. Dario brought him documents in pieces, the way you revealed catastrophic information, gradually, to give the recipient time to absorb each layer before the next one arrived. But the pieces accumulated faster than Dario's careful pacing could manage, because once Cassian had authorized a full audit of the Ravenna structure, the threads pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Matteo had known about Alara's investments not from Dario's trace, but from his own surveillance. He'd had the organization's accounts monitored at a level Cassian hadn't authorized, using a private financial investigator who'd been reporting to Matteo for 4 years. The investigator had identified the first of Alara's injections within 6 months of it hitting the architecture. Matteo had sat on that information for 3 years. 3 years of watching his son build an empire on a foundation his wife had secretly laid, and saying nothing. Not nothing. Worse than nothing. He'd used it. He'd built his case for removing Alara on the private knowledge that she had leverage. Leverage she wasn't using, had never used, would likely never have used, but leverage that existed and that Matteo experienced as an intolerable imbalance of power in a family that only knew one direction for power to flow. The investigators' reports were in the file. Cassian read them late at night in the study, alone, with no lights on except the desk lamp, in the particular silence of a house where the wrong person had been living for the last 6 weeks and was now absent, leaving behind a different quality of emptiness than the one that had preceded her. He read Alara's name in the investigators' reports written in the dry, clinical language of financial surveillance. Subject transferred funds via intermediary on the following dates. And something in the region of his sternum did something that he didn't have clean language for. Not grief. Past grief. Something on the other side of grief, in the territory where regret calcified into something structural. The empire was real. The growth was real. The organization he now commanded was genuinely one of the most significant private financial forces in Europe, with legitimate holdings that generated returns his father's generation would have considered impossible. All of that was real. And it had been seeded by a woman he'd abandoned in front of 300 people because his father had paid his ex-girlfriend to walk through a door. He closed the file. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He picked up because in his organization, unknown numbers sometimes carried information that mattered. Mr. Varelli, a woman's voice. Professional, precise. My name is Irene Solberg. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Intelligence Unit of the European Commission. He went very still. I'd like to discuss some irregularities we've identified in the transaction records of the Ravenna holding structure, she continued. Specifically, we're looking at a 4-year pattern of transfers that appear to route capital from sanctioned entities through your family's holding architecture into the Varelli Group's legitimate operations. Cassian closed his eyes. When would you like to meet? He said. Tomorrow morning would be ideal, she said. We can come to you, or you can come to us. Either way, I want you to understand that we're at the beginning of this conversation, not the end. Your cooperation at this stage would be relevant to how the next phase develops. He understood the language perfectly. He'd been on the other side of it often enough. Come to me, he said. 10 o'clock. He hung up. He sat in the study with the desk lamp throwing a circle of light across the folder and the dark pressing in from every direction. And he thought about Alara in an Edinburgh flat building, something clean from the ground up. And he thought about Matteo in Como with his lake view, and his lifetime of decisions dressed as necessities. And he thought about himself, sitting in a house that felt wrong, running an empire built on a foundation he hadn't known about, facing a European Commission investigation into transactions he hadn't authorized but now owned by inheritance and succession. He picked up his phone again. He dialed Dario. I need an emergency meeting with our legal team, he said. Tonight, all of them. How serious? Dario said. Commission, Cassian said. Financial intelligence. They have the Ravenna records. A silence on the line that Dario almost never permitted himself. I'll make the calls, Dario said. There's something else, Cassian said. I need you to find the best forensic accountant in Europe who has no previous relationship with this organization. Someone completely clean. He paused. Someone who can help me understand exactly what my father built and exactly how to separate it from everything that needs to survive. That's going to take time, Dario said. Then start now, Cassian said. He hung up. He looked at the folder on the desk, at the investigator's reports with Alara's name and clinical surveillance language, at the transfer records that documented what she'd given him without his knowledge and without conditions. He opened the desk drawer. The 2 rings were there, not on the table anymore, not where she'd placed them on that last night in the kitchen. He'd moved them to the drawer at some point, without ceremony, the way you move something you couldn't deal with to a location where you didn't have to look at it constantly. He looked at them now. They were very small against the dark interior of the drawer. 2 rings and a very large silence. He thought about what Irene Solberg had said. We're at the beginning of this conversation, not the end. The commission investigation would go where it went. Matteo's fingerprints were on the Ravenna structure in ways that were documented and traceable. The sanctioned entity transfers. He didn't know yet the full scope, but he knew his father well enough to know that whatever Matteo had done, he'd done completely, because Matteo Varelli did not do things by half measures, which meant the next months were going to be the most dangerous period the organization had ever faced. Not from rivals or from the families they'd displaced, or from the men who'd been waiting years for a moment of vulnerability. From a European Commission investigator named Irene Solberg with clean hands and documented evidence, and the particular patient menace of a legal apparatus that moved slowly and ground completely. And in the middle of it all, the only person who had ever understood the financial architecture of this organization well enough to help him navigate it. The only person who could look at the legitimate structure and the shadow structure and articulate clearly where one ended and the other began, was a woman in Edinburgh who had told him, in a flat with rain on the windows, that she was finished. That was the specific shape of his situation. He closed the drawer. He stood up and turned off the desk lamp and stood in the dark of the study for a moment, in the house that still smelled faintly of Valentina's perfume, and more faintly, beneath it, of the particular clean scent that had belonged to Alara, which he was probably imagining but which his brain produced anyway, because his brain was at this point operating with a cruelty he'd done nothing to deserve and everything to earn. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, the European Commission would sit across from him and begin dismantling the empire his father had corrupted and his wife had quietly built, and he had blindly inherited. The man who walked into that meeting could not be the man who had stood in a salon for 17 minutes and made the worst decision of his life. He was going to have to become something else entirely. Not the mafia heir performing legitimacy, not the dutiful son performing independence, not the grieving husband performing control. Something actual. Something that could withstand the kind of scrutiny that was coming and make the decisions that would need to be made, and do it without Matteo's guidance and without Alara's architecture and without any of the scaffolding that had held the version of himself he'd been for the last decade. He walked out of the study. He went upstairs. He lay down on the bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around him, and sometime before dawn, with the Milan sky going from black to the deep gray that preceded everything, a thought arrived that was so clear and so complete it felt almost like a sound. He needed to go back to Edinburgh, not to ask her back, not to offer money or involvement or any form of the transactions she'd refused, not to relitigate the marriage or the gala or the 17 minutes or any of it. He needed to go back because the commission investigation was going to surface Alara's investments, the transfers Dario had traced, the seed capital, all of it. And when it did, her name would appear in documents being reviewed by European financial regulators, and she would become, through no fault of her own and entirely through his, collateral damage in a legal proceeding she had nothing to do with. She needed to know that was coming. She deserved that warning from him directly, before she read about it somewhere else. He reached for his phone on the nightstand. He opened Dario's contact. He typed, "Book Edinburgh. First available flight tomorrow after the commission meeting. Don't tell her I'm coming." He put the phone down. He closed his eyes. Outside, the sky was moving toward gray, and the city was beginning its machine-like morning assembly, and Cassian Vorelli lay in the dark and understood, with a precision that had taken him far too long to develop, that the empire his father built was burning, and the only question left was whether anything worth keeping could be pulled from the fire before it reached the foundation that Alara had. Irene Solberg arrived at 9:58. She came with 2 associates, a younger man carrying a briefcase with the careful posture of someone who understood that the documents inside it were more dangerous than anything in the room, and a woman in her 40s with the particular watchful stillness of someone who had spent her career reading rooms and the people in them. Solberg herself was around 50, compact, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and eyes that moved across the Vorelli Group boardroom with the systematic efficiency of a camera doing a site survey. Cassian's legal team, 4 of them, led by his senior counsel Adamo Ferra, was already seated on one side of the table. Cassian sat at the head. He had slept 3 hours. He had shaved, put on a dark suit, drunk 2 espressos, and built a wall behind his face that he intended to hold for the duration of whatever this morning was going to cost him. Solberg sat down. She set a single folder on the table. She did not open it immediately. "Thank you for making time on short notice," she said. "You didn't give me much choice in timing," Cassian said. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not a smile. An acknowledgement. "No, we didn't." She folded her hands on top of the closed folder. "Mr. Vorelli, I want to be direct with you about where we are. The Financial Intelligence Unit has been tracking capital flows through the Ravenna Holdings structure for approximately 14 months. We have documentation of 47 distinct transactions over a 4-year period that route funds from 3 entities currently under EU sanctions through Ravenna into the legitimate operating accounts of the Vorelli Group." She paused. "The total value of those transfers, including the compounded returns generated by investments they seeded, is substantial. The legal exposure is significant." Farah leaned forward. "My client was not the operational director of Ravenna Holdings during—" "Your client is the named successor and current controlling authority of the Vorelli Group," Solberg said, without heat, without hurry. "The question of who made the original decisions is relevant, but separate from the question of current liability. We understand that perfectly well, and so do you." She looked at Cassian directly. "What I came here to tell you, personally, is that the direction this investigation takes over the next 90 days depends very heavily on the posture the Vorelli Group adopts in the next 90 days. Meaning cooperation, Cassian said. Meaning active, documented, complete cooperation, she said. Not managed disclosure, not strategic partial transparency. Everything. Every record, every structure, every transaction the Ravenna architecture touched for the full 4 years. She finally opened the folder. In exchange, we're prepared to discuss frameworks that separate the legitimate Vorelli Group operations from the sanctioned funds exposure, which would allow the legitimate business to continue operating during the investigation and potentially, to emerge from this process with its core structure intact. And my father, Cassian said. Solberg looked at him steadily. Matteo Vorelli's exposure is his own. That's a separate conversation. But it's happening. It's happening, she confirmed. Farah put his hand on Cassian's arm, a gesture of counsel. Cassian looked at the hand, then at Farah, and Farah removed it. I'll need 48 hours to review the scope of disclosure you're requesting, Cassian said. You have them, Solberg said. She stood, and her associates stood with her. Mr. Vorelli, I want to say something outside the formal record of this meeting. She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind exactly, but was very direct. I've looked at the Vorelli Group's legitimate operations, the ones that don't touch Ravenna. They're genuinely good work. The housing developments, the entrepreneurial investment structures, the community capital initiatives. She paused. Whoever built that architecture understood something about what money can actually accomplish when it's pointed correctly. She picked up her folder. It would be a significant waste to lose it. I hope you understand that. She left. The room held its silence for a moment after the door closed. Farah exhaled slowly. That's actually... she's giving us a path. I know what she's giving us, Cassian said. He stood up. He walked to the window. Below, the Milan street moved with its usual indifference. A delivery truck. A woman walking fast with a coffee. 2 men arguing about a parking space with the passionate commitment that Milanese men brought to parking disputes. He thought about what Solberg had said about the legitimate operations. Whoever built that architecture understood something about what money can actually accomplish. Alara had built it, and in roughly 72 hours, when the Commission's formal disclosure request arrived and the Vorelli Group's records were open to investigators, Alara's name was going to surface in those records. The seed capital. The investment structures. All of it documented, all of it traceable, all of it about to become part of a formal European Commission investigation file. He turned from the window. "Get the Edinburgh flight," he said to Dario, who was standing near the back wall. "Afternoon, whatever's available." Dario nodded and took out his phone. Farah stood. "Cassian, before you do anything—" "It's not a negotiation, Adamo," Cassian said. "Start pulling the Ravenna records, all of them. Everything Dario's team has already identified and everything beneath it. I want a complete picture by tomorrow morning." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "We're cooperating, fully. Start building the framework tonight." Farah stared at him. Are you certain? Complete cooperation means— "It means my father is going to face what he built," Cassian said. "Yes, I'm certain." He looked at his lawyer with the flat steadiness of a man who had made a decision at 3 a.m. and had not moved from it since. "Get it started." He walked out. Whoa. The Edinburgh flight landed at 4:15 in a low gray sky that was moving fast, the kind of Scottish afternoon that made the light feel borrowed and temporary. Cassian had sat in the window seat for the 2-hour flight with his eyes closed and his hands flat on his thighs, not sleeping, just existing inside the preparation for what came next. He took a car to Leith, same route as February. The city looked different in this season. The stone darker from recent rain, the trees along the water of Leith carrying the last of their autumn color, everything in the specific key of a place that was beautiful in a way it didn't ask you to notice. He stood outside her building. He buzzed. A pause. Then, "Who is it?" Not a question. A flat statement because she already suspected. "Me?" he said. A longer pause. The door buzzed open. She was standing in the doorway of the flat when he reached the landing, arms crossed, in the same kind of simple clothes as last time. Dark jeans, a cream sweater, hair loose. She looked at him with eyes that were doing their calculation thing, running the variables, and he could see, because he knew her face better than he knew almost any other fact about the world, that she'd already started building the hypothesis for why he was here before he'd opened his mouth. "Commission," she said. He stopped on the landing. "How—" "You wouldn't come back this fast unless something had escalated past the point where you could manage it alone." She studied his face. "And the only thing that escalates past your capacity to manage it is external legal pressure." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. The flat was different than February, more inhabited, more lived in, with the texture of a space that had become genuinely someone's home rather than a temporary landing point. There were more books, a large planning board on the wall with maps and figures and colored markers, the foundation's expansion architecture. He recognized the geographic spread, a coat on the hook by the door that wasn't hers, which he noticed and filed and did not comment on. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. He sat at the table without being invited to. "European Commission Financial Intelligence Unit," he said. "They have the Ravenna records, 14 months of tracking, 47 transactions, sanctioned entities running capital through my father's holding structure into the group's legitimate accounts." He watched her back at the counter. "When the formal disclosure opens the group's records, your investment structures are going to surface. The seed capital, the Ferretti transfer, all of it." She didn't move for a moment, just stood with her hands on the counter. "How long before disclosure?" she said. 48 hours before the formal request. Then the investigators will have access within 2 weeks, maybe less." She turned around. Her face was composed, but her jaw was set in the specific way it's set when she was working through something that required both her analytical and her emotional processing at the same time. "My transfers were completely clean," she said. "No sanctioned connections, no—" "I know they were clean," he said. "They're your transfers. Of course they were clean." He looked at her steadily. "But they're going to appear in the same investigation that's looking at sanctioned capital flows. And your name is going to be in a commission file, and the foundation is 3 years old and completely independent of everything you just described," she said sharply. "Yes. And a commission investigator looking at your connection to the Varelli Group is going to require documentation of that independence that you're going to have to produce under legal scrutiny." He kept his voice even. "I'm not saying it destroys anything. I'm saying you need to know it's coming so you can prepare, not find out when someone from Solberg's team calls your solicitor." The kettle clicked off. She didn't move to pour it. She stood with her arms crossed and looked at him across the small kitchen, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, and the flat was very quiet except for the sound of Edinburgh outside the window, which was wind and the distant mechanical sound of the city going about its business. "Who's Solberg?" she said. "Lead investigator, she's—" He paused. "She's good. She's actually trying to separate the legitimate operations from the contaminated ones. She mentioned the Foundation's community capital architecture specifically, called it well built." Something moved in Alara's expression. Not pride, something more complicated and more guarded than pride. "She knows it was mine," Alara said. "She doesn't know it was yours. She knows it's good." He looked at her. "She will know it was yours within 2 weeks." Alara uncrossed her arms. She turned and poured the tea with the automatic precision of someone who needed something to do with their hands. She poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of him and stood at the counter with the other. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I'm here because your name is about to appear in a commission file, and you deserve to hear that from me before it happened. That's all." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her cup. "You're cooperating with the investigation." "Completely." "That means your father—" "Yes." A pause. "Cassian." Her voice shifted slightly, not soft exactly, but different. That's not a small decision." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. Really looked, the way she did when she was seen past the surface architecture of a person into something structural. He let her. He was too tired to construct anything for her to look at except what was actually there. "You found out about Valentina," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Your father arranged it." "Yes." She set her cup down. She pressed her fingers flat on the counter. He watched her absorb this, not dramatically, not with the visible distress that the information warranted, but with the particular internal efficiency that was one of the most distinctly Alara things about her, the way she processed even devastating facts as information first and feeling second. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up. "For which part?" "For all of it. But right now, specifically, for the fact that what my father did means your name is now attached to an investigation you have nothing to do with." He held her gaze. "You gave me everything you had, quietly and without conditions, and my father used the fact that you'd done it as a reason to get rid of you, and now the same architecture you built is the thing that's going to drag your name into a commission file." He paused. "That's a specific kind of wrong that deserves a specific acknowledgement." The kitchen was very still. Outside, the wind picked up briefly and moved something against the window glass. A branch, a leaf, something small and momentarily loud. "The coat by the door," he said quietly. It came out before he'd decided to say it. He looked at the table rather than her face. "Someone else." A pause that lasted just long enough. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the tea in front of him, which he hadn't touched. He wrapped his hands around the cup because it was warm and his hands were cold from the outside air, and he needed something concrete to hold. "Good," he said. He meant it. He meant it in the specific way that only people who had genuinely loved someone could mean a word that cost that much to say. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it. Something in her posture changed. A tightening, a rapid recalibration. "What?" he said. "It's Priya." She picked up the phone, read something, read it again. "The commission contacted the Foundation's legal office an hour ago." She looked up. Her eyes were sharp. "They're not waiting 48 hours. They've already issued the preliminary disclosure request." Cassian's jaw tightened. Solberg moved faster than she indicated. "Or someone tipped them that you were coming here." She set the phone down. Her voice was very controlled, which means they're already connecting your visit to me as a relevant variable in the investigation. He stood up. "I have to call Farah," he said, reaching for his phone. "Cassian?" Her voice stopped him. He looked at her. She was standing very straight, both hands flat on the counter, and her face had the particular focused quality it got when she was operating at full capacity under pressure. The foundation has 18 months of clean operational history, full independent legal structure, and no financial connection to the Varelli group that post-dates our marriage. She looked at him steadily. If the commission is smart enough to separate the legitimate architecture from the contaminated one in your organization, they're smart enough to follow the same logic with the foundation. She paused. But I'm going to need my lawyers to build that case tonight. I know, he said. Which means you need to tell me exactly what's in the Ravenna records that touches my name. Every transaction, every date, every intermediary structure. He looked at her. This was not a request from a former wife. This was a request from the woman who had built the architecture being discussed. Who knew it better than Dario? Better than Farah? Better than Solberg's investigators? Better than anyone alive except possibly his father? And who was now, with the flat precision of someone who did not waste motion under fire, preparing to defend what she'd built. He sat back down. He pulled out his phone and opened the files Dario had sent. The first transfer, he said, originated from an account held in your name at a Zurich private bank, routed through a Luxembourg intermediary into a structure registered in... I know the structure, she said. She sat across from him and pulled her own laptop open. I built the structure. Give me the dates. He gave her the dates. She typed without looking up from the screen. Her fingers moved fast, with the particular authority of someone working in familiar territory. Outside the Edinburgh window, the afternoon light was failing, the sky going from gray to the dark pewter of a Scottish early evening, and the wind had picked up again and was pressing against the glass with a low, continuous sound. They worked for 40 minutes without stopping. She asked questions in the clipped, precise way she had when she was operating at full speed, not hostile, just stripped of everything non-essential. He answered them the same way. Date, amount, structure, originating account, receiving entity. She cross-referenced, flagged, built the separation architecture in real time, her face lit by the laptop screen in the diminishing light of the flat. At some point, she got up and turned on the overhead light, without breaking her typing rhythm. At some point, he got up and poured the cold tea out and refilled both cups with hot water from the kettle and set hers beside her laptop without comment, and she didn't acknowledge it and drank it without looking up. His phone rang at 6:42. Farah. They've issued the preliminary to our offices as well, Farah said, his voice carrying the compressed tension of a man operating on no sleep and too much information. It's broader than Solberg indicated this morning. They're going back 5 years, not 4. Cassian looked at Alara across the table. 5 years, he said. She didn't look up from the laptop. That captures the hospitality credit line. Yes, Farah said through the phone. Which means... I know what it means, Cassian said. Is Solberg reachable tonight? I can try. Try. Tell her I want to call at 8. Tell her the full cooperation framework is moving, but I need to discuss scope before the formal disclosure is filed. She'll want something in exchange for the call. Tell her I have information about the sanctioned entity contacts that hasn't appeared in her records yet. He kept his eyes on Alara as he said it. Information that comes from inside the Ravenna architecture. Things my father's private investigator documented that haven't surfaced in the commission's existing evidence. A pause from Farah. Is that true? Get me the call, Cassian said, and hung up. Alara had stopped typing. She was looking at him. Your father's investigator, she said. The one who found my investment transfers. He documented 4 years of internal surveillance on the organization's financial movements, Cassian said, including records of meetings between my father and the representatives of the sanctioned entities. Dates, locations, amounts discussed. Things that weren't in the official Ravenna records because my father kept them separately, because he didn't trust the structure he'd built. He looked at her steadily. Dario has the investigator's archive. All of it. If you give that to the commission, my father faces everything, Cassian said. Yes. The word landed between them and stayed. She held his gaze for a long moment. You came here to warn me, she said. But you also came here because you'd already decided. I decided at 3 this morning, he said, in the study, alone. He looked at her. The warning was real. It's not the only reason I came, but it's real. She looked at him with an expression he didn't have full access to. Layers behind it that she wasn't making available, and that was her right, and he understood that and accepted it the way you accepted the weather in a country that wasn't yours. The foundation will be fine, she said finally, not to comfort him, just as a statement of operational fact. My lawyers can build the separation case. The commission will see it. I know, he said. And the Varelli Group? He exhaled slowly. The legitimate operations survive if I cooperate completely and move fast. Farah thinks so. Solberg implied it. He pressed his hands flat on the table. There's going to be a period that's going to be difficult, publicly difficult. The kind of thing that makes the papers and damages relationships and requires rebuilding everything from a lower position than I currently occupy. Yes, she said, simply, without false reassurance. I can manage that, he said. I know you can, she said. And somehow those 4 words from her, with the complete absence of either comfort or condescension, just the flat recognition of a fact she considered settled, hit him harder than anything else she'd said across the 2 times he'd sat at her kitchen table and tried to navigate the wreckage of his own decisions. His phone buzzed. A text from Dario. Solberg agreed to the call. 8 o'clock. She wants the investigator's archive as a precondition for any scope discussion. He showed Alara the screen. She read it, looked up. She's good, she said. She said the same thing about you, he said. About the foundation's architecture. Something moved in Alara's expression that she controlled quickly, but not quite fast enough. Send the archive, she said. If I send it tonight, there's no walking it back, he said. Once Solberg has it, my father, Cassian. Her voice was quiet but completely firm. Send the archive. He looked at her for one more moment, then he picked up his phone and dialed Dario. Send Solberg everything from the investigator's files, he said. All 4 years, tonight, before 8. He could hear Dario processing this. A pause of maybe 3 seconds, long for Dario, who processed quickly. Understood, Dario said. He hung up. The flat was quiet. The Edinburgh night had fully arrived outside the windows, pressing dark and cold against the glass. The planning board on the wall threw its colored map lines across the room in the overhead light. Alara's laptop was still open, the separation architecture she'd been building for the Foundation's legal team filling the screen. She looked at him across the table. You should probably go, she said, not unkindly. You have a call at 8 and you need to be somewhere private for it. Yes, he said. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked around the flat one more time. The books, the planning board, the maps of the places her foundation was building, something real and lasting and completely her own. He looked at the coat by the door. Is he good to you? He said. He hadn't planned to say it. A long pause. Yes, she said. He nodded. He put his jacket on. He walked to the door. He had his hand on the handle when she spoke behind him. Cassian. He turned. She was standing at the kitchen table, one hand resting on the open laptop, in the flat she'd made into a home, in the life she'd built without him. And she was looking at him with the full weight of everything she knew about him. The complete picture, his best and his worst, and his most inexcusable. And her expression was not soft, and was not hard, and was not forgiving, and was not refusing to forgive. It was something else. Something that only existed between people who had been genuinely known by each other and had survived the loss of it. The man who sent that archive tonight, she said, that's the one I believed in. He stood in the doorway and let that land. Then he turned and walked down the stairs and out into the Edinburgh night, which was cold and wet and indifferent and exactly right. And he stood on the stone pavement for a moment with the wind moving through him and his phone already in his hand, and the 8 o'clock call with Irene Solberg 20 minutes away. And everything. The empire, the investigation, the reckoning with his father, the long and grinding process of becoming the thing he should have been years earlier, waiting on the other side of it. He walked toward the car. Behind him, in the lit window of the flat 3 floors up, a shadow moved. Alara crossing to the window or crossing away from it, he couldn't tell, and he didn't let himself stop to look. The phone rang in his hand. Bera. Solberg confirmed the call. She received the first batch of files from Dario. She says, a pause. She says it changes the scope of what she can offer. Good, Cassian said. Cassian, this is going to be a very hard next 6 months. I know, he said. Your father is going to— I know what my father is going to do, he said. He got into the car. The door closed behind him, shutting out the Edinburgh cold. I know exactly what he's going to do, and I know exactly what I'm going to do. And those two things are going to be in direct opposition to each other for the first time in my life. And I need you to make sure that when they collide, the organization is protected. He paused. The legitimate one. The part that was actually built to do something real. That's the part that survives. Are we clear? We're clear, Farah said. The car pulled away from the curb. Through the window, the Edinburgh street moved past in the dark, and somewhere above and behind him, the lit windows of the building diminished and disappeared, and ahead of him the road opened toward the airport and Milan and the hardest confrontation of his life. And Cassian Vorelli sat in the back of a car in the dark and felt, for the first time in 7 years, something that was not regret and not grief and not the heavy specific weight of everything he'd lost, but something else, something that required him to be completely, irreversibly no longer his father's son. And it sat in his chest like the first breath after a long time underwater, which was not comfortable and was not clean, but was absolutely— The call with Irene Solberg lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Cassian took it in the back of the car, parked in a side street 3 blocks from Edinburgh Airport, with the engine running for heat and the windows fogging slightly at the edges, and Farah patched in from Milan and Dario on a separate line, feeding documents in real time as Solberg's team in Brussels received them and cross-referenced them against their existing evidence architecture. Solberg was methodical. She moved through the investigator's archive with the patience of someone who understood that thoroughness now saved catastrophic problems later. And she asked her questions in the flat, precise way of a person who had heard every version of every story and was no longer interested in versions, only in facts, dates, amounts, names. Cassian answered every question. He answered them without deflection, without the managed disclosure that Farah had initially recommended, without the careful lawyerly architecture of partial transparency that powerful men use to maintain the illusion of cooperation while actually controlling the flow of damage. He answered them the way Alara had taught him to approach a problem, completely, structurally, with the understanding that the only foundation worth building on was an accurate one. Farah interjected twice with protective qualifications. Both times, Cassian overrode him. At 11:47, Solberg said, "Mr. Vorelli, I want to confirm what you've provided tonight against what we already held. The investigator's archive gives us direct documentation of your father's personal involvement in authorizing the sanctioned entity transfers. It gives us meeting records, communication logs, and financial instructions that have his authorization on them explicitly." A pause. "This is not ambiguous material. Do you understand what you've given us?" "Yes," Cassian said. "And you're providing it voluntarily with full knowledge of its implications?" "Yes." Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, so not warmer, but carrying the particular quality of a professional who had just recalibrated her assessment of the person she was talking to. "The framework I outlined this morning," she said. "Separation of the legitimate Vorelli Group operations from the contaminated Ravenna structure. Full independent oversight for a period of 36 months. Mandatory restructuring of the board to include external commissioners." A beat. "That framework is still on the table. Given what you've provided tonight, I'm prepared to recommend it formally to the commission within the week." "What about the foundation?" Cassian said. "The Whitmore Legacy Foundation?" A brief pause that told him she'd been waiting for this question. "Our preliminary review of the foundation structure indicates clean independence from the Vorelli Group's contaminated assets. Ms. Whitmore's original investment transfers predate the sanctioned entity contacts by over 2 years and originate from unrelated personal funds. Barring anything unexpected in the full disclosure, the foundation falls outside our scope." He let out a breath so slowly it was almost silent. "I'll have Farah send the formal cooperation agreement by morning," he said. "We'll expect it," Solberg said. And then, in the same neutral, professional voice, "Mr. Vorelli, the work that was done to build the legitimate side of your organization, the community investment structures, the housing development portfolios, the entrepreneurial capital initiatives, that work is genuinely valuable, not just financially, in terms of what it does for actual human beings." A pause. "I hope you understand the responsibility that comes with being the person left standing to protect it." I'm beginning to, he said. She hung up. Farah started talking immediately. Logistics, timeline, the morning's filing requirements, and Cassian let him talk, providing the necessary responses. While outside the fogged windows, the Edinburgh street held its dark, and the airport's distant lights made a pale smear against the low cloud, and the car's engine turned over steadily in the cold. He got on the last flight back to Milan at 1 in the morning. He did not sleep on the plane. Matteo Varelli was informed of the Commission's formal investigation and his named status as a primary subject of inquiry on a Thursday morning in October, 11 days after the Edinburgh call. He received the notification at his Como house from his own lawyers, who had been contacted the previous evening by the Commission's office. Cassian knew the approximate timing because Dario monitored the process and reported it. He did not go to Como. He did not call. He sat in his office in Milan on that Thursday morning and looked at the lake through the glass and felt the particular heavy stillness of a man who has done something that cannot be undone, and has made his peace with that, and is still, nonetheless, sitting inside the weight of it. His phone rang at noon. His father's number. He looked at it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. He picked up. "You did this," Matteo said. His voice was different than Cassian had ever heard it. Not broken. Matteo Varelli did not break, but compressed. The way old stone compressed under sustained load, and the specific quality underneath the compression was something Cassian identified after a moment as genuine shock. His father had not believed he would do it. In 68 years of operating on the conviction that he understood how power worked and who held it and how it moved, Matteo had not believed his son would hand the Commission the archive. "Yes," Cassian said. A silence. "Everything I built, everything you built on sanctioned capital is going to face the process it deserves to face," Cassian said. His voice was level. He was not angry. He had moved past anger somewhere in the 11 days since Edinburgh, into a territory that was harder and quieter and more permanent. The parts that were built legitimately survive. I'm making sure of that. "I built this family," Matteo said, and now there was something raw in it. Something that in another man in another moment might have produced sympathy. "Everything you have." "I know what I have," Cassian said. "I also know what it cost." He paused. "I know about Alar's investments, Papa. I know you knew about them for 3 years before the gala. I know you used that knowledge as the justification for what you did." He waited a moment. "You removed the person who actually built the legitimate foundation of this organization because she had leverage you didn't control. And then you handed me an organization whose real foundation you just destroyed and expected me not to notice." Matteo said nothing. "Get a good lawyer," Cassian said. "Better than the ones you have now. You're going to need it." He hung up. He set the phone face down on the desk. He sat in the office for a long time after that, in the particular silence of a man who has just permanently altered the landscape of his family, and he let himself feel the full weight of it without trying to process it into something more manageable, because it wasn't manageable, and he was done pretending that the things that mattered were. The following 6 months were exactly as hard as Farah had promised. The Commission investigation produced 3 separate news cycles. The first when the formal inquiry was announced. The second when Matteo Varelli was named as primary subject. The third, the most damaging, the one that required Cassian to sit with his communications team for 2 solid days managing the fallout, when a financial journalist connected the dots between the Ravenna structure and the Varelli Group's legitimate operations and published a piece that was accurate in its facts and devastating in its framing. Partners pulled back. 2 significant investors suspended their commitments pending the investigation's outcome. The hospitality portfolio took a valuation hit that required immediate restructuring. 3 board members resigned, which was anticipated, and in 2 of those cases was actually a clarifying development, removing people whose loyalty had always been to the version of the organization that Matteo had built, rather than the version Cassian was trying to salvage. He worked 18-hour days for most of those 6 months, not the performing power kind of long days that powerful men used to signal commitment, but the actual grinding, functional work of someone rebuilding structural integrity from the inside. Document reviews, legal strategy sessions, regulatory meetings, the patient and unglamorous process of demonstrating to the Commission's oversight team, through action and record and consistent transparency, that the Varelli Group's legitimate operations were genuinely what they claimed to be. Dario stayed. That mattered more than Cassian said out loud. Farah stayed, which was less surprising. Lawyers stayed when the billing did. But he worked with a focused competence that went beyond the transactional, and Cassian recognized this and noted it, and did not sentimentalize it, but understood it as one of the things that made the difference between surviving and not. Elara's name appeared in the commission documents, as anticipated. Her lawyers, a firm in Edinburgh that moved with impressive efficiency, produced the independence documentation within 48 hours of the formal request, and Solberg's team reviewed it and confirmed the foundation's separation within the week. Cassian received a brief message from Priya, not from Elara, from Priya, that said simply, "Foundation cleared. Thank you for the warning." He read it twice and put his phone away and went back to the document review in front of him. He did not contact Elara directly. She was building her life. She had told him she was finished, and she had meant it with the complete precision that she brought to everything she meant. And the most honest thing he could do with that, the thing that was actually different from the man he'd been, was to respect it without making his respect into another form of pressure. He sent one message, 3 months into the investigation, through Dario to Priya, to her legal team. A notification that 2 of the Foundation's operational grant structures had been referenced in the Commission's separation documentation as examples of independent legitimate capital deployment, which could be used by the Foundation's legal team as positive Commission recognition if they needed it for any future regulatory or funding applications. He signed it with his initials. He did not wait for a response. The Commission issued its formal separation finding 14 months after the Edinburgh call. The Varelli Group's legitimate operations were confirmed as independent of the sanctioned capital flows and cleared for continued operation under 36 months of external oversight. The contaminated Ravenna structure was formally dissolved. Its assets were seized and redirected through a commission-administered process. Matteo Varelli accepted a negotiated settlement, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation with the broader sanctioned entity's investigation, which had expanded well beyond the Varelli case into a larger commission inquiry that would occupy investigators for years. He was required to divest his remaining organizational holdings, pay a substantial financial penalty, and submit to ongoing monitoring. He was 69 years old. He would likely not face criminal prosecution if he maintained the terms of the settlement. His lawyers had done their jobs. Cassian read the settlement terms in Farah's office on a gray February morning, 14 months almost to the day after he'd sat in an Edinburgh car with fogging windows and answered every question Irene Solberg asked him. He read the document completely. He signed the accompanying Varelli Group compliance confirmation. He handed it back to Farah. "It's over," Farah said. "This part?" Cassian said. He drove back to the Milan house. He went up to the study. He sat at the desk. He opened the bottom drawer. The box with the 2 rings was there, where he'd moved it from the nightstand 6 months earlier because he'd needed the nightstand clear and because putting the box in the drawer felt like a decision rather than an avoidance. He took it out. He opened it. The rings were exactly as they'd been. 2 small objects with no power of their own, holding only the weight that memory and loss and the long, complicated process of becoming someone worth being lent them. He closed the box. He did not put it back in the drawer. He set it on the desk and looked at it for a while, and then he got up and went to the window and looked at the Milan street below, which was going about its Thursday afternoon business with the complete indifference he had once found alienating and now found almost comforting. The world's insistence on continuing regardless, its refusal to calibrate itself to any individual's internal weather. He thought about what Elara had said in the Edinburgh doorway. "The man who sent that archive tonight. That's the one I believed in. Not, come back. Not, I forgive you. Not, try again. Just that one. The one who could do the hard thing when the hard thing was the only real option left. He had been trying to be that man for 14 months. He was not finished trying. He suspected he would not be finished for a long time. That was acceptable. He saw her again 8 months after the commission finding, at the Vienna summit. He had known she would be there. The invitation had included her name as keynote honoree, which was how the evening had begun in his memory of this story, which was now also the beginning of this particular scene. The ballroom, the chandeliers, The crowd of powerful men performing the confidence that proximity to other powerful men lent them, and Alara walking through the doors. He had known it was coming, and he was still not prepared. She was different in ways that were not entirely visible, but were entirely present. The way she inhabited the room had a quality of settled authority that went beyond the composure she'd always carried. She was not performing ease, she was at ease, which was a different thing and harder to acquire and impossible to counterfeit for very long. She was introduced. The room applauded. She moved to the front with the precise, unhurried walk he would have recognized in a crowd of 10,000, and she shook Cornelius Hacht's hand and said something that made him laugh, and then she turned and looked at the room with those eyes that missed nothing. They found him. They held him for one fraction of 1 second, less than a breath, less than a heartbeat, and then moved on. Not the neutral furniture recognition of their first encounter in this kind of room years ago. Something different. Something that acknowledged without performing. Something that had passed through the full fire of everything that had happened and come out the other side into a territory that didn't have a clean name but was real. He stayed on his side of the room. He did not approach her before the event. He did not engineer a moment. He held his water glass, still not drinking, 4 years now, and talked to the people who came to him, and did the thing you did at these events, and waited. After the formal portion ended and the room softened into the social configuration of people who had made their deals and were now performing the enjoyment of each other's company, she came to him. She moved through the room to where he was standing near the eastern wall, and she did it without announcement, without the look that people gave when they were approaching someone they were anxious about, just directly, the way she did everything. "Cassian," she said, "Alara." He looked at her. Let himself look without the guarded management he'd spent years deploying. "You were remarkable up there." "You've gotten better at compliments," she said. "I've had time to work on things." A small pause. Not uncomfortable. Just the natural pause of two people who had a great deal of history and were choosing carefully what to bring into the present moment of it. "The Varelli Group," she said. "I've been following the restructuring. The Oversight Board presents their first annual report in March," he said. "Solberg's team lead the review. I expect they'll find it satisfactory." "I expect they will too," she said. And then, with the particular directness that was irreducibly hers, "You did what needed doing, with your father, with the commission, all of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know what that cost." "You always knew what things cost," he said, "even when I didn't." She looked at him for a moment. Around them, the ballroom continued its operations. Glass sounds, conversation, the distant movement of servers, the accumulated noise of powerful people in an expensive room. None of it touched the small perimeter of quiet that existed in that corner. "The foundation is expanding," she said. "Eastern Europe, 3 new country programs. We're opening an innovation center in Warsaw in the spring." "I saw the announcement," he said. "The photographs from the groundbreaking." He paused. "You looked—" He stopped himself because the word that had arrived was happy, and it was true, and he had the right to observe it, but was not sure he had the right to say it. She looked at him with the slight tilt of her head that meant she'd heard the word he hadn't said. "I am," she said simply. He nodded. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He had put the box there this morning, before leaving Milan, without being entirely certain he would use it. He had held it in his hand for a moment in the bedroom that was different now, the house that was quieter now, the life that was smaller and more honest and more entirely his own. And then he had put it in his pocket because it belonged in motion, not in a drawer. He set the small box on the surface of the narrow ledge they were standing beside. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not giving it back," he said. "I'm not asking anything. I just—" He stopped, found the actual words, which were harder than the rehearsed ones. "I carried it for too long as something it wasn't. A second chance. A thing I was owed." He looked at the box. "You put it in my hand the night you left. You placed it very carefully. I understand now what that meant, that it was mine to carry, mine to figure out." He looked up at her. "I figured it out." She looked at him for a long time. The ballroom moved around them. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. A server passed with a tray. The chandelier above threw its fractured light across everything equally. The powerful and the uncertain, the arrived and the still becoming. What did you figure out? She said. That I spent years treating it as a representation of what I'd lost, he said, when it was actually a representation of what I'd failed to protect when I had it. Those are different things. The first one is about me. The second one is about you. He paused. I needed to understand the difference before I could stop carrying it the wrong way. She looked at the box for a moment. She did not pick it up. I'm not, she started and then stopped, and for just one moment something moved behind her eyes that was not composed and not calculated, just the raw, briefly visible fact of everything the two of them had been to each other. It passed quickly, with the practiced efficiency that he recognized as the discipline of a woman who had done the hard internal work of arriving at a life she actually wanted and was not about to destabilize it for the pull of what had been lost. I know, he said. I know you're not. I'm not asking. Then what are you doing? He looked at her. Closing something properly, he said. Instead of the way I've closed everything else, badly, halfway, with loose ends I told myself I'd come back to. He picked the box up, put it back in his pocket. That's all. She watched him do it. Then she did something he had not predicted. She exhaled. Long, slow, the specific exhale of someone releasing something they'd been holding at a particular tension. Not grief. Something more complex, the release of a weight she'd been carrying too, the counterpart weight to his. The thing you carried when someone you'd loved completely had hurt you completely, and you'd had to build everything after it with that fact as part of your foundation. You're different, she said. I'm trying to be, he said. No, she said, and her voice was quiet and precise. You are. Past tense. Not trying. She looked at him with the full, clear attention that had always been one of the things about her that was hardest to be on the receiving end of, because it saw everything and softened nothing. The man you were at the gala would never have done what you did with the commission, would never have walked into his father's house and said what you said, would never have stood here and said what you just said without some angle in it, some play for what came next. She paused. There's no angle in this, I can see that. No, he said. There isn't. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she did something small. She reached out and briefly, with the tips of 3 fingers, touched the outside of his jacket pocket where the box was. Not a gesture of longing, not an invitation. Something else. An acknowledgement, precise and brief, of the full weight of what that box contained and what it had taken for him to carry it differently. Then she withdrew her hand. The Warsaw opening is in April, she said, her voice returning to its normal register. There's a summit attached. The commission will be represented. Solberg's team. I heard, he said. The Varelli Group's community investment portfolio would be eligible for partnership recognition, she said. Formally. Through the Foundation's standard vetting process. She met his eyes. If you submitted an application. He looked at her. That's the process, she said. Standard vetting, independent review, no special consideration. A pause so slight it was almost not a pause. But it would be considered. He understood what she was offering. Not reconciliation, not the past reclaimed, something actual and forward-facing. The possibility of 2 separate, legitimate, genuinely built things existing in the same space and doing something useful together, with full transparency and no hidden architecture and nothing owed to anyone. I'll have the application submitted through the standard portal, he said. Good, she said. She looked at him one last time, with the full weight of what she knew and the full freedom of someone who had decided, through her own process and on her own terms, what the future held. Take care of yourself, Cassian, she said. You too, he said. She walked away from him into the room, back into the crowd that parted slightly for her, the way crowds parted for people who carried genuine authority. And he watched her go. And then he looked away. Because watching too long was its own form of indulgence he was trying to spend less time in. He looked at the room instead. The chandelier light, the old marble. The crowd of men who controlled things, and the few women who controlled more. And the particular atmosphere of an evening where power was being negotiated under the form of celebration. He was still the most feared man in the room. He was also, for the first time, not entirely sure that was the most interesting thing about him. Bohem. He flew back to Milan the next morning. He drove from the airport to the house, and let himself in and stood in the entry hall in the quiet that was his own now. Not Valentina's absence, not Alara's absence, not the hollow echo of a life shaped by someone else's blueprint, but his own quiet, earned, inhabited. He went to the study. He sat at the desk. He took the box from his pocket and opened it one final time and looked at the two rings in the morning light that came through the east-facing window and fell across the desk in the particular way it had always fallen, consistent and indifferent and sufficient. He thought about what they were, not a second chance. He had understood that since Edinburgh. Not a failed love, which was the easy story, the one that let him be the protagonist of his own grief rather than the architect of his own failure. Not a symbol of what had been taken from him. Evidence, he thought. That's what they were. Evidence that he had once been loved completely by someone who saw him clearly, and that he had failed to protect it, and that the failure had cost exactly what it should have cost, and that the cost had changed him in ways that nothing easier would have managed. He closed the box. He did not put it back in the drawer. He set it on the corner of the desk, where he would see it, not as a wound, not as a monument, as what it was, a fact about who he had been and what it had taken to become someone else. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the Whitmore Legacy Foundation's partnership application portal. He began to fill out the form: organization name, contact information, summary of community investment portfolio, evidence of operational independence and transparent financial governance, letters of reference from the Commission's Oversight Board, which he had, 3 of them, signed by Irene Solberg's team. He worked through it with care. No shortcuts, no leveraged relationships, no back channel to expedite the review. The standard process, submitted through the standard portal, to be assessed on its actual merits by people who owed him nothing and would give him nothing he hadn't earned. He reached the final section. Please describe, in your own words, the core mission of your organization and what you hope to contribute through this partnership. He sat with the cursor in the empty field for a moment. Then he began to type. He wrote about the housing development portfolios and the community capital initiatives and the entrepreneurial investment structures, the legitimate architecture, the part that had been built to actually do something, the part that Alara had first seen clearly and helped him build when he hadn't yet understood what he was building. He wrote about where it was going, the expansion plans, the new country programs, the 36 months of oversight that had, instead of constraining the organization, clarified it, burned away everything that had been attached for the wrong reasons and left what was genuinely structural. He wrote, "This organization exists to do what money can actually do when it's pointed correctly. We are still learning what that means. We expect to continue learning for a long time." He read it back. He submitted the application. He closed the laptop. Outside the study window, the Milan morning was assembling itself. The street sounds, the light moving across the buildings opposite, the city doing what cities did, which was continue, indifferent and generative and relentlessly forward-moving regardless of the weather of any individual life within it. He stood at the window. He thought about Alara in Warsaw in April, standing at the opening of something she'd built from nothing but her own capability and her own clarity, and the decision she'd made in an Edinburgh flat in the rain that the version of herself that waited for him had to disappear, so the version of herself that stood in rooms like that could exist. He thought about his father in Como, under monitoring, in the late autumn of a life defined by the conviction that power was its own justification, learning for the first time what it felt like to be on the other side of that conviction. He thought about Dario, who had traced the records that changed everything and then stayed anyway, which was its own kind of loyalty and deserved to be recognized as such. He thought about Irina Solberg, who had looked at the legitimate architecture of an organization built inside a corrupt one and said, it would be a significant waste to lose it, and had meant it, and had built the legal framework to protect it, because she understood that the work mattered independent of the people who had failed around it. He thought about a small box on the corner of a desk. He turned away from the window. He sat back down at the desk and pulled toward him the stack of board documents that needed review before the monthly meeting, and he began to read them, carefully, line by line, with the full attention of a man who had learned, at significant cost, that the details were where everything actually happened, not in the grand gestures, not in the public confrontations, not in the dramatic moments that assembled themselves into the shape of a story from the outside. In the details, in the daily decisions, in the choice, made again and again without audience or applause, to be the man who did the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. That was the work. He did it. The Milan morning continued outside the window. The city did not notice or care. That was exactly as it should be.